A couple of quotes. This first one happens to be from my former director when I was a faculty member at Cornell University back in the 1970s. Immunity can be ascertained only by actual exposure to the test pathogen under circumstances in which appropriate controls sicken while test animals remain healthy. If a serologic test can be correlated with that challenge immunity, then that test becomes an indicator as reliable as actual exposure. And that's what titers are all about. That's what these antibody tests are all about, because we obviously can't go around challenging every dog to know whether it's protected against distemper. So we have to have tests that work, and we do have very reliable tests for distemper and parvo of both the cat and the dog and of adenovirus in the dog. So this is a quote from yours truly. Serologic antibody analysis is an excellent indicator for immunologic memory. Now, what is immunologic memory? Well, that's what's critically important. When you give a vaccine, you want the immune system, just like the neurologic system, to remember that it has seen that particular virus, and when it sees it again, it will either prevent it from infecting, or it'll prevent it from causing disease. That's what immunologic memory is about. Now, a lot of people would say, well, there's no way to measure immunologic memory. Yes, an antibody test does measure immunologic memory. In fact, it measures the product of a memory effector B cell, because that particular cell is what's making the antibody, and if you're detecting antibody, that memory effector B cell has to be there. So you're measuring immunologic memory when you're doing these titers. And not too many folks would have ever thought about that very much, and they'll tell you you can't measure immunologic memory.
Okay, so here we have another poll question. This question is for shelters and rescues. When is your organization able to vaccinate incoming animals? Right away at intake? Within 24 hours of intake? Between 24 hours and 3 days of intake? Between 4 days and 7 days of intake? After 7 days of intake? And not applicable. So again, this is for shelters and rescues. When is your organization able to vaccinate incoming animals? So we're getting some good answers here. We'll just give you another moment to respond. If you haven't answered yet, please go ahead and respond. Okay, so it looks like about 31% of you said right away at intake. 18% said within 24 hours of intake. About 12% between 24 hours and 3 days. About 4% between 4 and 7 days. And 1.4% after 7 days. Thank you.
That's great. The earlier you can get the animal vaccinated, obviously the greater the chance is that that vaccine will provide protection in the non-vaccinated and non-immune dogs, which brings up a point that I don't have on the slide, but I can tell you that a lot of studies that we've done in shelters around the country, we actually find that up to a half of the dogs coming into the shelter has no distemper immunity. About 30% don't have parvo immunity, and that doesn't mean that somebody gave a parvo vaccine and didn't give a distemper vaccine. It's just that parvo is so much more resistant in the environment that those 20% of dogs that didn't have the distemper but just had the parvo, really natural immunization occurred as a result of natural infection with the parvo. And whether the dog got diseased or not, we don't know. But as long as it gets infected, it will be naturally vaccinated. So in terms of panleukopenia, we see about 50% of cats coming into shelters that have never seen panleukopenia. So a lot of our animals coming into shelters really do need those vaccines. So protective immunity then, canine immune response to vaccines has really been studied, as you know, for years. And we have antibody immunity, we have cellular immunity. Unfortunately, the cellular assays are difficult to perform and often really don't correlate with protective immunity. So that's why we actually use antibody tests, because they correlate much better with protective immunity. And we've done quite a bit with various in vitro cell-mediated immune assays, and you can see here another quote from one of my articles on that. Unfortunately, the in vitro correlates of cell-mediated immunity have not been demonstrated to serve as reliable indicators of protective immunity, due in part to the variability in response and the difficulty of correlating those results with challenge infection. So many people will say, well, you might not have humoral or antibody-mediated immunity, but you may have cell-mediated, and that's true, but don't count on it. I like to see antibody, and I will tell you why in a few moments, because you're not likely to have one in the absence of the other. So in contrast to the antibody test or humoral immunity, responses from vaccination or recovery from infection have been correlated with immunity in a number of canine diseases. So what we do then is we really demonstrate what provides the best in vitro or test evidence of protective immunity in a challenge model. And it turns out that it is antibody. So the best correlations have been shown between serum antibody and protection for the following canine and feline diseases using the following gold standard tests.